Now that we are done with Genesis, we're going to pick up the pace and start moving a little faster. Already we are at Module 4 and we've still got quite a bit of the Old Testament to cover. However, let's first pause and begin with prayer. Oh Lord, thank you for being a God who breaks into human history to save your people. Long ago you brought the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt and made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, that you would be their God and that they would be your people. Then you saved your people again by sending your Son to die and be raised on the third day, making all of us even today your people through a new covenant made by a law written on our hearts. Work in our lives and our hearts as we seek to obey your will and walk in your way. Through Jesus Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. Okay, let's take a little bit of time to catch our breath and just remember where we are. We have already covered the book of Genesis, and in the outline suggested by Professor Dean McBride in his work on the Pentateuch, he says that the structure of the book should look something like this. Genesis is kind of the prologue to the Pentateuch, and that's the part we've covered so far. Now, in this module, we're going to cover the next three panels, the three panels in the middle. The first one is going to pertain to the Israelites' sojourn from Egypt, or their trip from Egypt to Mount Sinai, which will take us through Exodus 1 to 18. And then in Exodus chapter 19, the Israelites will arrive at Mount Sinai, and they will stay there until Numbers chapter 10. And that is where they will receive the covenant and the law that God is going to give them through Moses. And then the next part of the Pentateuch is going to be from Sinai to the plains of Moab. That is going to be where the Israelites will continue their travels through the wilderness, finally arriving in Moab at the very end of the book of Numbers. And then Deuteronomy is what we might refer to as the recapitulation. And so once again, you'll see that the different parts of this outline correspond to one another. So the prologue, we could say, corresponds to the recap. The journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai corresponds then to the journey from Mount Sinai to the plains at Moab. And so one might say that the central core of the Pentateuch is going to be this sojourn at Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, verses 10 to 10. The lecture today is going to cover this part here from Egypt to Mount Sinai and spend time on the first part of the story about the sojourn at Sinai. And the rest of it, unfortunately, I won't have time to talk about, but I hope you will read the pertinent reading assignments to help you come to a better understanding of how those materials play a role as well. Okay, so please open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, and follow along with me as we begin to make our way through these interesting stories. In the first part of Exodus, of course, we're going to have the stories about the Israelites in Egypt. The first question I'd like to pose for us to think about before we go on is, what is the status of the promise now at the beginning of Exodus? And by the promise, I'm talking about that promise of land, descendants, and blessing that God had given to Abraham. Okay, so land, obviously they're away from their own land, and so it might seem that that part of the promise still needs to be fulfilled yet. But the descendants part of the promise is going pretty well, and the beginning of Exodus is going to describe that. It will begin by giving the names of the people, the names of the sons of Jacob who went down to Egypt, and remind us that with everybody's wives and children, the Israelites, when they got there, amounted to 70 people. And verse 7 is a significant verse in the passage in the book. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong. And of course, that reminds us once again of the command that God had originally given back in Genesis 1:28, where he told the people that they are supposed to be fruitful and multiply. However, in verse 8, we're going to see a suggestion that all of a sudden the conditions are going to change for these Israelites who've now become a great people. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Let's deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Now, most historians think that this verse, verse 8, is a reference to the overthrow of the Hyksos dynasty in about 1550. The Hyksos invasion had taken place in 1720, and these people had been ruling over Egypt since then. It is likely that the Hyksos would have been fairly friendly to the Israelites because the Hyksos were also of Semitic stock, and so ethnically they had something in common with the Israelites. In 1550, however, the Hyksos, like we said, are going to be overthrown, and the next dynasty of native Egyptians is going to come to the throne. And this is probably the new king who arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So now that we once again have native Egyptians ruling on the throne, they are going to be threatened by the presence of the Israelites, as the story is going to go. And you are familiar with what they have done in order to try to stop the Israelites from expanding. In chapter 1, verses 15 through 22, we have the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who refuse to follow the Pharaoh's instructions to kill all baby boys that are born to the Hebrew women. And so that is what allows, presumably, Moses to be born. And then Moses is also able to survive the order of Pharaoh that all young children be killed, because Moses' mother hides him away once he is born and then has him put in a basket in the river until he is found by a member of Pharaoh's house, by Pharaoh's daughter. As Moses grows up, you're probably familiar with some of the things that happen to him, and eventually he is forced to run away. And so he goes out into the desert in a place called Midian, where he gets a job keeping the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. So we see that some of these themes that we're already familiar with in Genesis are going to find themselves repeated here. So let's move now to Exodus chapter 3 and talk a little bit about this event where Moses is called by God to go and lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. As you are well aware, as Moses is out in the wilderness taking care of the sheep, he sees a bush which is on fire, but yet the bush is not consumed. And so when he goes over to it to see what is happening, God calls to him out of the bush, and this is where Moses' instruction comes to go and lead the Israelites out of Israel, or out of Egypt. Let's review briefly the structure of this passage, of this story of Moses' call, because Moses' call here to go and complete a task on behalf of God, Moses' call in a sense to be a prophet here, is going to be fairly similar to other call narratives pertaining to other prophets that we have in the Old Testament. And so first, the call narrative is going to include a divine confrontation. In this instance, an angel of the Lord will appear to him in a flame of fire out of a bush, verse 2 will tell us. So we can see that there is influence here of the Pentateuchal author E, according to the source hypothesis, because you'll remember we've said that in Wellhausen's understanding, the E writer had God speak through angels or visions because God was not quite as imminent in E's understanding. After the divine confrontation is going to come the introductory word, and then after that we will have the commission itself, where after having introduced what he is about to ask Moses to do, God tells Moses, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, up out of Egypt." The next element here is going to be the objection. And that's something that we are going to see fairly frequently in the call narratives, the story about the call of Isaiah, the story of the call of Jeremiah will also contain this. But as usual, God is not going to allow the person to get by with objecting, and so instead God is going to give a reassurance. And so we see in this way that the call of Moses corresponds to the structure of a typical call narrative. And I'd like to invite you to keep this in mind so that we can look at it again when we get to some of the other stories about some of the other prophets. Okay, and then after the reassurance where God tells Moses, "I will be with you," he's also going to give him a sign. This is the sign that it is I who sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. And again, signs are going to be fairly important, fairly typical in prophetic call narratives. The second thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the conversation between God and Moses that ensues, beginning in verse 13. After this call story comes to a conclusion, so to speak, or after this part of the structure comes to a conclusion, Moses is going to continue to question God. And in this case, we're going to see that Moses will ask God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Back in the ancient Near East, the name of a deity would have been very important. In fact, anybody's name was seen to express that person's identity, to really be an expression of that person's essence. What's interesting here is that when Moses asks this question of God, what is your name? That God prevaricates. God seems very hesitant to say anything. Instead of actually giving a name, God is going to say to Moses, I am who I am. And then continuing in verse 14, God will say further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. And so what happens here is that when Moses asks the question, God essentially gives him an answer of a name that is a form of the verb to be. Okay, so it seems that God does not fully want to reveal his name to Moses because knowing the name of a deity in those days could give the worshiper some kind of power over the deity. And of course, they want to make it clear that Moses did not have that kind of power, that God simply would not allow that. So instead, God calls himself, I am who I am. I am, in other words, has sent me to you. And then he goes on to say in verse 15, thus you shall say to me, the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. Now, where you see the Lord in all capital letters there in verse 15, that is actually the typical English translation of the name Yahweh. Okay? And we talked about Yahweh already back in the very beginning of the course, but this is how Yahweh is usually translated, is as the Lord written in all capital letters. Again, the name Yahweh consists of 4 consonants, Y-H-W-H. We don't know for sure exactly how it was pronounced because they did not write the consonants back in those days. Consonants were not added to the Hebrew text until much later, perhaps sometimes toward the end of the first millennium AD. And so all we know here is that God's name, Yahweh, often written just as a capital Y-H-W-H, is somehow related to a form of the verb to be. Okay? So some people have said that the name Yahweh means I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, or some even suggest that it comes from a causative form of the verb to be. I cause to be what I cause to be. So there's still a little bit of a puzzle about the precise nature and meaning and even pronunciation of God's name as it is spoken to Moses here. But what is important here is that this is the time at which Moses is taught that this is God's name, that Yahweh is God's name, and the connection is made between that name and the ancestors. So in verse 15, God calls himself Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. If you have any more questions about that, feel free to ask, and you can also look at the discussions in some of the textbooks. But let's move on from here and talk a little bit about the plagues and the escape from Egypt and the travels in the wilderness and so forth. As you're going to be aware, Moses and Aaron are going to eventually go back, and they are going to ask Pharaoh to allow them to take the people, the Israelites, out in the wilderness to worship. Of course, they're not going to tell Pharaoh right away that they tend to leave altogether. When Pharaoh refuses, we have the series of 10 plagues, each one more horrific than the last, being brought down on the people. You might remember that for the first, in the very beginning, um, Pharaoh's own magicians are able to replicate, okay, what Moses and Aaron do, and so he's not impressed, but eventually they are no longer able to replicate it. And then finally, after the last of these plagues, the killing of all the firstborn of the Israelites, Pharaoh tells Moses and Aaron to take the Israelites and be gone. But of course, he soon thereafter changes his mind, and so right after they exit Egypt, the Israelites are on the run from Pharaoh and his army. Uh, Finally, they of course run into the Red Sea, and God provides the miraculous means for them to cross that. The prose version of the story of Exodus is told in chapters 14. Chapter 15, on the other hand, is the poetic version. And it's kind of interesting to compare the poetic and the prose versions of the Exodus. Chapter 15, most scholars think, is one of the oldest parts of the Pentateuch that we have, going back to the very earliest roots of the J narrative. And it's interesting to read this and to look at how they portray God. Chapter 15, verse 1. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. So in chapter 14, it talks about the Israelites marching into the dry seabed of the Red Sea and having the waters come down on them. The poetry version here is a little bit more graphic in its description and almost gives you the imagery of God picking those armies up and tossing them into the sea. What's also interesting here is that chapter 15 portrays God as a warrior. So in verse 3, the Lord is a warrior and the Lord is his name. It goes on to describe God further as a warrior in verses 6 and 7. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent out your fury, it consumed them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The flood stood in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. Finally, in verse 12, you stretched out your right hand. The earth swallowed them. One of the challenges here in reading a passage like this is trying to figure out historically what it might have looked like, and there have been a lot of debates about that through the centuries. I'm going to point you to the textbook, Dr. Arnold's textbook, on pages 106 to 110, where he gives a nice summary of that, and he also takes up the issue of what was the name of the body of water they passed over. Traditionally, it has been called the Red Sea, and so some people have assumed that they crossed somewhere in the Gulf of Suez, which is part of the Red Sea. More recently, a lot of scholars, probably most scholars, think that the Hebrew word Yam Suf actually means Sea of Reeds or Reed Sea, which means they could have covered or traversed some body of water anywhere between the tip of the Gulf of Suez all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. As historians point out, we don't have any archaeological evidence to help us, but in any case, somehow the story tells us by miraculous means the Israelites were able to make their way across this body of water. There are different paths here. Some people have suggested that the Israelites took a route straight across to the east like this. However, here you're going to see that the traditional route of the Exodus is usually seen to take the people right down here along the Gulf of Suez to Mount Sinai, which is down near the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula. Once again, we don't know for sure exactly where they went or where it is, but of course, if you go to Israel today, Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses, is still there, and you can go up and watch the sunrise from the top of Mount Sinai. course, then the Midianites may have lived somewhere down in this area, but we also see Midian placed here on this map. And of course, remember, it is among the Midianites where Moses finds his wife and where he is keeping the sheep when he has the vision of the burning bush, or when he has the encounter with God at the burning bush. Remember also in Exodus 3 that God tells Moses, when you have come out, you shall worship God on this mountain. So apparently Moses was in the vicinity of Mount Sinai, wherever it may have been when he had that encounter with God. Okay, the next few chapters are going to tell us about the travels of the Israelites through the wilderness. And then finally, in chapter 19, the Israelites are going to arrive at Mount Sinai. And as we have said, they are going to be here at Mount Sinai through the rest of the book of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the book of Numbers, receiving the covenant that God has given them. So let's take a look at this very key passage, Exodus 19, 3-6, and see what happens as they begin to have God approach them and form this relationship with them at Mount Sinai. Read along with me, if you will. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. So we see once again that very important word covenant comes up. This is the third instance of God forming a covenant. The first was with Noah, and then secondly with Abraham, and now we have God's covenant with the entire people that he is going to make with the people through Moses. However, there is a small two-letter word in this passage that makes this covenant quite a bit different from the previous covenant that God has made. And that two-letter word is the word if. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possessions out of all the peoples. What happens here then is that this covenant that God makes with the people through Moses is going to have a very strong conditional element to it, whereas the covenant with Abraham and the one with Noah had emphasized more of the unconditional aspect. In fact, there are two different kinds of covenants in the ancient world that are borrowed upon by the Old Testament writers. One is what is called a covenant of grant. Okay, this is where somebody gives or grants something to somebody else, whether it is money, land, a kingdom, or a child. That's the kind of covenant that we have God making with Abraham, where God promises simply to grant him something or to give him something. However, the other kind of covenant that we have in the Old Testament is a treaty covenant, a covenant where both sides are expected to do something to uphold their end of the bargain, so to speak. So if the covenant with Abraham was a covenant of grant, this covenant with Moses is a treaty covenant. There's an emphasis on something that both parties are to do, and so it is more conditionalized. In the first instance, God promises to have them as his holy, specially chosen people, his priestly kingdom, and his holy nation. However, for the Israelites to keep up their end of the bargain and to keep the covenant valid, they are supposed to obey his voice and keep this covenant. And so the basis of the covenant is laid out right here in what God says to the people. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Now, in the rest of really this section of the Pentateuch, okay, so in the rest of Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers 10, that's all going to be devoted to laying out for the Israelites in particular what are those conditions that they are supposed to keep. What are those prescriptions that they are supposed to follow as their end of the bargain in keeping up this covenant. However, before we get to those prescriptions, first of all, the rest of chapter 19 is going to be describing the experience of the theophany that the Israelites have. God is going to reveal himself. God is going to make himself known to them in the form of thunder and earthquake and volcanoes and all of these different natural phenomena at once. And all of this is going to scare the people so much that Moses is eventually going to become and is going to be appointed as the mediator to talk to God on the people's behalf. In fact, even God himself says in verse 21 to Moses, "Go down and warn the people not to break through the Lord to look, otherwise many of them will perish." Now, following Exodus 19, then with Exodus 20, we are going to begin laying out the terms of that covenant. What is it that the people are supposed to do to keep their end of the covenant? And so the 10 Commandments are going to summarize that, of course, in 10 commands, or sometimes it is more literally called 10 words. Dr. Arnold, in his textbook, has a very interesting passage on how these 10 Commandments are numbered differently in different religious traditions. So, for instance, Jews, most Protestants, and then Catholics and Lutherans will have 3 different ways of numbering them. What I think is most significant here, however, is that in chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, before God ever gives a single command, God is going to first tell the people what he has done for them. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." So before he tells them not to worship any other gods, he first says, "This is what I have done for you." And so everything that is to follow is a response to God's initial action on behalf of the people. Of course, the first of the commandments is that you shall have no other God before me. Dr. Arnold again talks a lot about this idea of no other God in the monotheism that he sees as the unique contribution of Israelite religion. This would have been kind of a shocking thing to tell people back in those days. In the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, nobody would have been so foolish as to worship only one God. You thought there were a multiplicity of gods, and you would try to worship all of them because you wanted to keep all of them happy. You didn't want to neglect one of the gods and then have that God punish you for it. So in order to cover all your bases, if you had to, you tried to worship different gods. But here, God makes it evident that he is the only one to be worshiped. And then after the 10 Commandments are given in verse 18, the people again are going to continue to experience this theophany of thunder, lightning, trumpet, smoke, and they are going to say to Moses, "You speak to us and listen, but do not let us speak to God, or we will die." And so from now on, again, God is going to be the mediator who is going to speak to God on the people's behalf. Following this, then, beginning in the next section, we're going to have a body of literature that is known as the Book of the Covenant. And the Book of the Covenant is going to contain various other laws that the people are supposed to follow. Most of the laws in this particular law code are usually seen to stem from the writer E. Okay, so these may kind of have a rural or northern emphasis, and they talk a lot about things pertaining to agriculture. Another thing that we can see in the Book of the Covenant is the difference between 2 different forms of laws. There are apodictic laws and casuistic laws. An apodictic law is a law that simply gives a blanket prohibition on doing something. So the laws of the Decalogue, of the 10 Commandments, for example, are apodictic laws. "You shall have no other gods before me. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal," and so forth. However, in the Book of the Covenant, we're going to have a lot of casuistic laws. Casuistic means case, so what is known even in legal profession today is case law, law that has been decided by judges based on various circumstances, and those circumstances are usually included in the law. Okay, and so usually an apodictic or a casuistic law rather is going to have an if clause and a then clause. So, like in chapter 21, verse 2, when you buy a Hebrew female or a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, then he can continue to be a slave, and so forth. But if the slave declares in verse 5, I love my master, my wife, and my children, then his master shall bring him before God, and he shall have his ear hammered to the door, okay, and so forth. So this is the difference between apodictic and casuistic law that you will find in many Old Testament textbooks. So these laws in the Book of the Covenant are going to take us through the end of chapter 23, and then in chapter 24, God is going to have a ceremony with the people to announce this Book of the Covenant. The people are going to come and make sacrifices. In verse 6, he's going to take the blood from this animal that they have sacrificed. He'll take half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he will take and he will dash against the altar. And then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. See, the blood of the covenant, Moses says in verse 8, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. After this, we're going to have the instructions that Moses is going to receive for the building of the tabernacle, and that will take us right up to chapter 32, and that's the last part of this material that I want to discuss in my remarks today, Exodus 32 to 34, where we see that the covenant is broken and then renewed in the incident of the golden calf. So let's review briefly what happens while Israel is up on Mount Sinai and he is delayed in coming down. The people come to Aaron and ask him to tell him that they don't know what has become of Moses. And so, of course, Aaron is going to have them gather all of their jewelry, and he makes a golden calf out of them. And as he sets it up, he says to them, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. As Moses is up on Mount Sinai in the meantime, beginning in verse 7 of chapter 32, God is going to immediately tell him to go down because your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely, and they have made this calf and worshipped it and sacrificed it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. God then, in verse 9, threatens to destroy the people. He says, I've seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone so that my wrath may burn hot against them and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation. What's interesting here is that Moses then asks God, begs God, pleads with God not to destroy the people as God has expressed his intention to do. He asks in verse 11, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? And then, God, you're going to make yourself look bad. Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them up to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying, I will multiply your descendants like the stars. And then in verse 14, the turning point, and the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he promised to bring on the people. So here we have a story about Moses is the intercessor who keeps God from destroying the people when they have broken the first two commandments so soon after having made a covenant to be faithful to God. Now, for sure, there's still some punishment dished out for the sin, and you can see the story about that towards the end of chapter 32. Then at the beginning of chapter 33, God is going to say to Moses, go leave this place, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, and go to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying to your descendants, I will give it. However, Moses, before they go, is going to um, ask for a promise of God's presence in chapter 33, verses 12 through 22. Moses says to the Lord, um, "Here's what you have said to me, but yet, um, if I have found favor in your sight, show me your ways, that I might consider you and find favor in your sight." God promises in verse 14, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Moses responds, "If your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here." So Moses gets from God a promise that God's presence would be with the people as they continue their journey through the wilderness. And then Moses asks for one more thing. In verse 18, he says, "Show me your glory, I pray." And God says, "I will make all my goodness pass before you and proclaim before you the name of the Lord. But you will not see my face, because no one can see my face and live." And this is the point at which God hides Moses in the rock and then passes by so that Moses can see God's back. So chapter 33 is all about Moses getting God to promise God's own presence to the people as they are continuing their journey through the wilderness. And then in chapter 34, the covenant is going to be restored as new tablets are going to be made. And I would encourage you to look further at the laws beginning in the latter part of chapter 34 and verse 10. So now let's to get a better understanding of the importance of this golden calf story, let's place it in the context of the whole covenant, the whole sojourn at Sinai. Again, this is borrowed from Professor S. Dean McBride, who sees the Pentateuch organized this way. Once again, we have this concentric ring structure, and at the very center, then, for him, at the very core of the sojourn at Sinai, is the Mosaic intercession, gaining divine commitment to be present with Israel, as he puts it. In other words, for him, this is kind of the heart of the Pentateuch, is that in the midst of all this disaster, the Israelites, in the midst of all the disaster, the Israelites are going to still obtain the presence of God to be with them as they continue on their journey. Following that, we're going to have the end of Exodus is going to have the building of the tabernacle and the further holiness laws, which I would invite you to read about in the textbook in the book of Leviticus. Before in Numbers 10, they finally get ready to get up and go on their journey again. Thanks for joining me today, and I'm enjoying all of my work with you this summer, and I look forward to continuing our conversations.